Welcome to this IPPR event on radical form. What's the Liberal Democrats' plan to drive up living standards? So this is hosted by IPPR, so we're an independent charity working towards a fairer, greener and more prosperous society. And this event is supported by Independent Age, who are a national charity providing support for older people facing financial hardship. So yeah, we've got a great panel of speakers today to talk about this. First of all, I'll just give a bit of a preamble. Basically, inflation is coming down, thankfully, but the cost of living crisis is far from over. And improving living standards is going to be central for objectives for the next Parliament. The cost of essentials like food and fuel remain unmanageably high for lots and lots of households. We've got record rates of food bank use, and our social safety net remains unprepared, to be kind, for future economic shocks. Meanwhile, we have 5 million UK households running negative budgets, by which we mean their income is far outstripped by what they need, what their outgoings, and they're unable to afford the cost of essentials. The Liberal Democrats have committed to setting a target to end deep poverty over the next decade and establish an independent commission that would recommend annual increases to the value of universal credit with a view that it covers the cost of essentials. This event is to explore the policies required to lift people of all ages out of poverty in the short term and the long-term reform that we need to drive up living standards across the UK. So in terms of who we've got here, I'm Henry Parks, I'm just chairing this event. I'm a senior economist at IPPR and I work on our social security work. We've then got Wendy Chamberlain to my left, MP for North East 5, and Chief Whip and Spokesperson for the Department for Work and Pensions. Many hats. Yeah. Wendy, thank you for joining us. We've then got Joanna, Elson, CBE, Chief Executive of Independent Age. And then on the end there, we've got Alfie Stirling, formerly of IPPR, now of the Rowntree Foundation. Alfie is Director of Insight and Policy there. You lead the Evidence, Economics and Policy teams at JRF. JRF's work is to speed up and support the transition to a future free from poverty in which people and the planet can flourish. So that's the opening bit. So I will now hand over to Wendy for her opening remarks, and we'll take it from there. So thank you, Wendy.
Lovely, thank you very much, Henry. It's great to be here this afternoon. I am flying between things, and I am, as you mentioned, wearing multiple hats, but hopefully with our new increase in MPs, maybe I'm going to take a couple of them off in the coming weeks, let's see. But it's good to see so many members here, but also I'm recognising lots of faces from different organisations that I've engaged with and worked with in my time as DWP spokesperson. And before I turn to the questions that have been posited, I think it's just useful to kind of consider the context. And one of the most important contexts is what the new incoming Labour government have said in terms of economic priorities, or that priority of growing the economy and creating business confidence, and how that potentially interacts with what we're seeing in terms of the challenges around deep poverty. I came into Parliament in December 2019. I've actually got it marked in my calendar in terms of when the general election was for our new MPs, so that I can tell them when COVID lockdown started. And in terms of that was one of the first things that I was dealing with as a new MP. And really one of the things that struck me then was, despite the fact that I was only bringing staff on board, but the very high volume of casework that we saw in as part of that. And the reality is people who had never got in touch with their MP before, had never come into contact with the welfare and social security system before, and found that the net had quite a lot of holes in it. And some of the really obvious stuff, and this fits in with sort of lack of investment in sort of public services, is the £20 uplift in universal credit that existed during COVID, and the fact that legacy benefits, primarily because the computer systems that support those legacy benefits couldn't cope with delivering that uplift. So we know that means that a lot of vulnerable people missed out. Part of the work I've been involved with in my time in Parliament is I've been chair of the APPG for Ending Need for Food Banks, great to see people just from the Trussell Trust here, and we conducted a cash or food inquiry during the last Parliament, because part of it is we're very conscious that One, emergency food provision is sadly vital for many, but it also is quite an undignified and difficult process. And if I'm thinking about sort of NHS getting people back into work, being well enough to work, those emergency food provisions are great, but not ambitious in the longer term to really ensure people's well-being. But just in the last couple of weeks, Russell Trust published data around the number of people on universal credit who are running out of money for food before the end of the month. So this is a very serious problem. I do think it's also important to consider sort of intergenerational impacts. The government have done two totemic things, I suppose, that potentially weren't expected of them since the election. One was obviously their position in relation to the two-child benefit cap, and their answer to that is a child poverty strategy. I'm sure any of you working in that sector or awareness of it, that strategy needs to deliver pretty quickly. The Liberal Democrats remain of the view that a very good central pillar to that strategy would be to remove the two-child benefit cap. And then, obviously, most notably, what's been happening with winter fuel allowance in recent weeks. And for me, there's a very inherent contradiction at the heart of what the government has done in relation to winter fuel. It says that it needs to make this cut in order to be able to save money because of the £22 billion black hole. I don't know if any of you have heard of that £22 billion black hole, because nobody in the new incoming government has mentioned it, but by the same token, they say they want to target an uplift in pension credit. And in fairness to the last government, there was I attended lots of drop-ins on pension credit in Parliament, and trying to ensure and raise awareness through, columns in the local newspaper, social media, writing to constituents about that uptake in pension credit. But that uptake has remained stubbornly below 70% despite those efforts. But if the government do achieve what seems to be impossible to achieve, that the 780,000 people who are eligible for pension credit who aren't claiming it and as a result will not receive winter fuel allowance did claim it, actually the savings the government would make from cutting winter fuel allowance would be lost in the payouts they would make for pension credit. So they can't have it both ways. It can't be a mechanism to save money for the government, but at the same time potentially lose the money. So for me, their arguments on that are wrong. But turning to the questions, I think one of the key things Parliament needs to do is better identify those at risk of deep poverty. And I think for me as a Liberal, that means investing in the resources and providing the support to local authorities and local organisations to better help that identification. And it's welcome to see an extension to the Household Support Fund being announced, but that's another one that's coming just for 6 months. And I want to see a difference in terms of some of the short-termism that we saw in the last Parliament from the Conservatives in relation to support such as the Household Support Fund. 6 months is welcome, but a 3-year commitment, for example, would allow local authorities to better plan how they could utilise that money. Because as we saw within that our Cashier Foods Inquiry report, local authorities are using that money in quite innovative ways, and we should be encouraging that so it best meets local needs. Obviously, as Henry said, we're calling for an independent commission. That was in the manifesto, but I think one of the key things is that we need to see governments committing to it. It does feel that a lot of policies, so for example the triple lock, those things worked in practice until the government steps back from them. And obviously the Conservatives did step back from triple lock in the last Parliament. And so one of my concerns is that in terms of an independent commission, we've got to ensure that there is agreement in relation to it. And again, another area where I worry about in relation to the new government is the fact that we've not seen anything coming forward yet in relation to WASPy women. Now, my view is that as a constituency MP, sometimes the ultimate arbiter for me is the Ombudsman, that I will sign the paperwork that allows my constituent to make their complaint there. Now that's supposed to be an independent Ombudsman, and I believe that it's my role to send complaints on so that they can deal with it, and that the bodies involved should adhere to the Ombudsman's findings. So for the government potentially to not be are choosing not to adhere to the findings of the Ombudsman report in relation to the loss of women is concerning, and I think sets at least an unfortunate precedent. In terms of actions Parliament should be taking to prioritise poverty in later life, I think we have to think about not just state pensions. I think we need to be thinking about the wider pension market. One of the things that I've done a lot of work on in the last Parliament is unpaid carers. I think all of us here know how passionately Davy cares about that, and the work that needs to be done, as well as the billions of pounds that are being saved to the NHS through unpaid carers. But I'm also very conscious that one of the reasons why we have such a large gender pension gap is because we have a gender pay gap, and actually that gender pension gap is driven by the fact that women are more likely to take time out of the workplace for caring responsibility, whether that be children or older people, and as a result can't make the contributions they need in order to be able to fulfil a state pension or indeed pay into a private pension. So I think that that's something that we should get serious about. We are living longer. We are generally living healthier lives, but if we don't invest in thinking about those provisions, but also, and any of you were in the hall there hearing Daisy's speech, investing in the NHS, because we clearly want people to live longer in good health. I did Any Questions a few weeks ago, and I was at a continuing care community in York, run by Rowntree. And what was really interesting about that was people could live in the bungalows that existed there, and then the initial intent of that was that they would eventually move into the care home at the centre. But over that time that they were in those bungalows, they paid a service charge that allowed them to access whatever they needed. So when they first moved in, the expectation was that they would be paying that service charge, but maybe not accessing much of the services. But over time, sort of cleaning, personal care, those things would be added before they went into the care home. What they have found there is people don't ever move into the care home because they are able to live in their own homes for longer because they have the support there. When they started off 25 years ago, average age in bungalows was 72, now it is 92, and that's just really quite incredible. I would also say I did get very strong Richard Osman Thursday Murder Club vibes there, but it was lovely and very welcoming. But finally, in terms of wider action, the government has a big majority. And I'm getting asked by lots of journalists, you've got 72, but you're just a protest group. What's the point of you? Thus it was for Liberal Democrats. But I think it's really important that they remember it's a fragile majority. It's a large majority that's been produced by the lowest sort of national vote share that we've seen in some time. So I think there are opportunities to work cross-party. We will have Labour MPs who are conscious of those majorities, and I think there will be opportunities to work across with them. But I think for ourselves as Liberal Democrats, that real focus on NHS and social care, which I think for me was arguably quite missing from the Darcy report, is where we should focus our efforts, and I would hope we could find some cross-party consensus to do so. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much for that. Joanna, over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to stand up so I can see you all. And I was just reflecting on the way here that I'm Chief Exec, as somebody said, of Independent Age, the charity working to end poverty for older people in older life. And a year ago, just about a year ago, my first day in this role was at the Lib Dem party conference, and Wendy was on our panel. And I was just reflecting what a lot has happened in a year. But nevertheless, we are still in a place where there are over 2 million people over 65 in poverty and around 1 million hovering precariously above that. And of course, we are not just interested in older people. It's great to have Alfie on the panel. It's great to have Trussell and others in the room. Together, we have to amplify the voices of those who are living in poverty, because we do not want people in this country, the 6th richest economy in the world, to be in that place. So I thought I would just get the winter fuel duty out of the way before I get on to other things. Wendy's talked about it already. A surprise to everybody, I think. A mistake, and still something that the party in government could do something about quite quickly. I don't know if any of you saw the impact assessment that was released on Friday. That was a Freedom of Information request. And one of the things that showed, so Wendy already said what low take-up there is of a pension credit, one of the, I think, the lowest income-related benefit. As she said, many of us have had a go consistently at trying to increase that, and we still will, of course. But what that impact assessment showed was that the government's modelling in deciding to go with that cut was that there would be a 5% increase. So in other words, going from 63 to 68% of those eligible taking up pension credit, leaving more than 30% of those eligible not taking it up, and therefore not getting the winter fuel allowance that we know so many of them rely on. So I'll leave that there on winter fuel payment. And I just wanted to touch on three things, actually. And many of them chime with what Wendy said already, but the three areas we've been focusing on and continuing to do are around income, costs and housing for older people. So firstly, on income, Wendy has already talked about the complexity and the gaps. I think you talked about the holes in the safety net. You look at pensions, it's a complicated set of circumstances, isn't it? You've got people who are on the new state pension, you've got people who are on less on the old state pension, you've got people who don't get enough because they the gender pension gap because they weren't paying in all the time. You've got people who come to this country from elsewhere and therefore don't receive all the benefits. You've got people with private pension pots. All of that makes a very complicated picture, and one which makes it very difficult to say this is what must happen. And therefore we're absolutely with Wendy that you need a cross-party look at it. And before you, and the triple lock clearly is not perfect, but before you consider moving away from that, you need a whole proper stand back to say what is an adequate income for people who are over 65. Now the government is doing a pensions adequacy review at the moment. We were with the Emma Reynolds, the pensions minister, last week, and we're saying to her and to her colleagues, that's a good opportunity. Let's have a look at this across the board. Or, if you don't want to do it there, let's do it somewhere else, but it needs to be done. So that adequacy piece is the first one. If we move then on to costs, we regularly hear on our helpline and through the grants that we give to charities right across the UK, about £5 million this year, to people we can't otherwise reach. What we hear from them are older people who are sitting in the dark, who are sitting with a coat on because they're frightened of putting the heating on, who are only eating one meal a day. And part of that is about the cost that they pay. So, if you're a single person, you're still paying for your electricity, you're still paying for your gas, you're still paying for your water. And now we know that many of the companies in these utilities offer social tariffs, not all of them, but they don't raise awareness of them very well, and they're not consistent. So we would like to see social tariffs across the board that everybody knows about, that you see on your bill, other ways trusted parties would tell you about them, and they're consistent, so everybody knows what it is you can claim. So that would be a second point on costs. And my third point is on housing, because I think it's perhaps a little known fact that the numbers of people in the private rented sector, numbers of older people in the private rented sector is growing significantly. So the census figures say that these go from 280,000 in 2001 to something around 330,000 in 2021 and continuing to rise. So probably somewhere between 400,000 and 500,000 older people living in the private rented sector now. And just imagine you're on a low fixed income and you've got the rent going up. What on earth do you do about that? And nobody in designing the pension system we had assumed that that would be a significant proportion of the people out there. We published some research earlier this year with some universities and others which showed that on current trends, by 2040, that around 500,000 older people in the private rented sector would go to above 2 million by 2040, meaning a significant increase in poverty for older people. Now, we all want to be in the place where we change that, so that is, if nothing changes, and obviously we want something to change. So that's another area. Housing is another area. Obviously, we now have the prospect of the Renters' Rights Bill, and we'll all be working, I'm sure, on that and scrutinising it and so on. So I think that probably is enough for now. On your seat, you might have seen this little leaflet, and the thing I wanted to draw your attention to there is we talked about the 2 million people importing. This shows where in the UK those people are. So in every region of the UK, you've got between 14 and 20% of pensioners living in poverty, and I think it's just worth clocking that and seeing what it is in your area. So I think I'm going to sit down and let you carry on. Thank you very much, Wendy.
Thanks, Joanna, and yeah, you'll be pleased to hear that we're doing some work on social tariffs with citizens' advice, very detailed work coming up in the next few months. So finally, over to Alfie.
Thanks, Henry. Really good to be here. Really good to be at Liberal Democrat Conference. Going to the panel, so thanks very much. I mean, I agree a lot of what Wendy and Joanna said. I'll probably just add maybe some comments on 3 related themes, just to sort of stir into the conversation. It'd be really good to hear what people are thinking and questioning at the moment. So the 3 themes are around just you touching on this issue of hardship and its urgency and depth. The second is trying to take into conversation a slightly broader notion of household economic security, beyond the sharp end of hardship and thinking about how does it play across the income distribution, how does it play across different dimensions of family life. And then a third remark around the relationship between this notions of hardship, economic insecurity, and the macroeconomic debate that's currently playing out, and some of the perils that we currently see in terms of politics. So on the hardship piece, I mean, maybe I'll just start by just adding a few little bits to Henry's really helpful primer just on the state of play, because one of the things that is a real issue with raising the salience of hardship, and many issues actually raising the salience of hardship, but one of them is that we don't have very good data. We don't have very good live account of what the lived experience for people is right now. The official statistics are normally a lag of 12 to 18 months. Those are the ones the government tends to refer to. So you have to rely on other pieces of information. So at Joseph Rowntree Foundation, we do a lot of work to try and plug that gap. And the picture really is grim at the moment. So in the month that the general election was called, you had about 7 million households in the UK going about essentials routinely over a 6-month period. So that means going about hot showers, not turning the energy, the heating on, foregoing basic toiletries, etc. Within that, you had 5 million households, again this is in May 2024, that were struggling to eat enough. So this is the live picture in the month that the election was called. And remarkable, by the way, that even though that was the #1 issue in the polling for the public, it really was not a big election issue in terms of what the politicians chose to respond to, some notable exceptions, including Wendy, I think. And then just on this context, a couple of other points. So we also know, and this is based on some modelling that Joseph Rowntree has done, using actually the IPPR market simulation model, that this year, post-tax earnings for households, this is after all the tax cuts that the last government brought in, are around £400 a year lower than they were at the start of the cost of living crisis. That is a huge deficit in earnings. And in terms of benefits, both including pensions and working age benefits, it's about £600 lower than it was in 2021. So you've got this really stark, acute pressure right now. I think that the prioritisation of the government on child poverty is really welcome. We've got the task force, we're waiting to see exactly how that materialises, what's its objectives, what sort of physical backing and resources does it have, but it is welcome. I think one of the things we're worried about is that hardship more broadly from families that don't just have children gets missed. If you look at hardship across the piece, whether that's material deprivation, some of the indicators I was mentioning earlier, families with children make up about a third of that group. So a really important third, and obviously children in particular, the harms are more acute from deprivation and hardship. But we've still got 2/3 of families in deep hardship, and not by any measure, material deprivation, deep poverty, that don't have children. And there's a danger that is not on the agenda in the way that it should be. So a piece of work we're doing at the moment is to put that back on the agenda, to think about what are the cluster of near-term urgent reforms that could be brought in this winter. And it ranges from reforms to universal credit in terms of deductions and benefit cap, thinking about crisis support locally, warm home discount, and also actually thinking about how you support asylums seekers more, both in terms of the absolute support they get, but the speed at which they can apply for no recourse to public funds and have access to the broader suite of support. So that's the first sort of just remark I was going to make about hardship. The second on economic security. So I think there's always a danger when we talk about we have these sort of conversations that we focus a bit excessively on levels of income or levels of resources. That is really important. It's fundamentally important. But there are also greater dimensions to this notion of economic insecurity that go beyond that. So in particular, thinking about a broader sense of resources that people have access to, so community resources, the relationships they hold, whether they can go to friends or family for support, in terms of their personal resilience, mental health, and in terms of security of their housing, tenure, their jobs, all go well beyond the level of income someone might have at a given point in time, but are fundamental not only to their current experience, but also their vulnerability to hardship in the future. And the second element that relates to that is then thinking really hard about the volatility of income, not just its level at a given point in time, or the volatility of security more broadly, and whether people, month to month, whether we're missing a picture, we just take snapshots and look at people's levels of income at the time. So we're doing a lot of work on this at the moment, trying to broaden this notion of household economic security. Hardship is a segment within that. It goes up the income distribution. It includes a very broad portion of the population that are actually vulnerable to a lack of economic security at any given point in time. And again, the policy response here has to be ambitious because the UK is in a dire situation. I think the Lib Democrat proposals around linking the adequacy of welfare in an institutionalised way to the cost of essentials is such a powerful and important reform agenda. It really is something that we've been calling for the last couple of years. I think there are two elements that are critical. One is to really peg the level of benefits and other forms of support to an actual needs-based measure. At the moment, we're just locked into a conversation around let's reverse the latest cut, or how much more or less is it now than it was 20 years ago. Arbitrary. What we need to know is how much people need and how much is the support with respect to that, and that's crucial. The second is to really just tighten that safety net so people don't fall below it. You might have adequacy at the right level. If you feel secure in the present, you can think to the future, invest in yourself, in the things around you, in the people around you, whether you're a firm or a household. And the third is that secure workers are more productive, more resilient workers. So your supply side of the economy is more healthy, more productive, if your input from people is stronger. And that whole part of the debate, that whole segment, is completely missing. And it's missing in a very explicit way in terms of the sequencing that the current government has brought in. I'll leave it there for now, but I'll
Thanks very much, Alfie, and thanks to all our speakers for all of those contributions. So we will now open it up to questions, of which I'm delighted to already see many. I will take my speaker's privilege to ask one or two first. One was just around pension credit. So lots of chat basically around how we really need to increase the take-up of pension credit. It's a good way to mitigate against this removal of the winter food payment if it is going to go ahead. Views on how, for anyone who wants to speak on it, how you would increase pension credit further, because the prize for that seems very large. Yes, the savings will erode, but it will make a huge difference to those people who are making claims. So yeah, interested on views on that.
Can I take that one?
Yeah.
Lovely. So, yeah, I mean, as I said, all of us are working on how we can increase uptake of pensions credit. It was Pension Credit Awareness Week a couple of weeks ago when we were making videos and getting material out to people. It doesn't move the dial enough, is the honest truth. So there are other things you could do. I was at a session last week which had two former pensions ministers there, your own Sir Steve Webb, and also Chris Pond, who was a Labour DWP minister way back when. And both of them were talking about some ideas. When Morgan and I, our own independent age Morgan sitting in front there, went to see the then pensions minister, Conservative pensions minister, in January this year, one of the things that he and officials said to us when we said, if you're eligible for pension credit, you get all kinds of other eligibility. So, council tax reduction and free dental and TV licence, all that stuff. If you've made people jump through the hoop of the 243 questions that there are on the pension credit form, surely you could just give people those other things that they're entitled to. And they said there's a principle in this country that people have to apply for all the benefits that they're entitled to. I've never heard of that before, and that seems weird. So that's the first thing you could do. But even better than that, what Chris Pond told us in this public meeting last week, ex-pensions minister, was that when he was a minister way back in the mid-90s, they considered with officials just giving pension credit to people rather than spending a lot of money on telling people that they were entitled to it and making them answer the 243 questions. So I think there's quite a lot there we could crack on with, to be honest.
If I can just come in briefly, my big concern is the sort of reporting around winter fuel allowance and the cuts has meant that there's been lots of articles about how complicated it is to apply for pension credit, and I've got a real fear that actually it's going to turn into even more of a deterrent. I think that is a real consideration. Yeah, my own view on this as well, this is across sort of DWP, is those links into HMRC are absolutely pants. That's not obviously the most technical term to utilise, but I think there is that disconnect between Treasury, DWP, HMRC, and actually this comes back into the Darcy report talked about the lack of investment from an NHS perspective, but I think there is a lack of investment in terms of government infrastructure, and actually if we improve the systems, which given that so much of what the previous government was doing was around DWP benefits was digital by design, which frankly is arguably exclusionary of older people. I think there should be an ability for those systems to work better so that people don't have to answer 243 questions in the first instance.
Right, we'll do questions. So let's jump here. I told you I wouldn't rove. This is difficult. This guy in the tie, the pink and blue stripes tie, very nice tie. Yeah. Oh, and then a third one. Yeah.
You've got to take a woman first.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, I can't. Yeah. Lady at the back who's waving.
Right.
Thank you.
I just want to make a point that it seems to me that people are vilified for not being in work, and yet people, jobs are being cut. I think government needs to look at, the availability of employment. That is, so that people aren't having to apply for, benefits and such like. It all has to do with human dignity. So I'd like the Liberal Democrat Party to, take this as an important point.
So just introduce yourself, I think.
Yes, John Brighton, for former councillor many times. My concern was, which is picked up from something that Wendy did say in passing, that women's pensions are often low because they haven't gotten enough years of national insurance contributions. It got me to think that there's another problem with national insurance being the entitlement trigger to get a pension, is that if you're working a very small number of hours, you don't pay it, therefore you don't get the trigger into your national insurance contribution. And if you are looking after an elderly relative, you're more likely to be in that situation because you only have to do a small number of paid hours outside of your carer's allowance. It seems to me the principle of entitlement to the state pension needs to be reviewed entirely, because then you could add people who are receiving carer's allowance get a credit towards their national insurance account, or perhaps parents with children 0 to 5 getting child benefit for that age group should also get a credit towards their national insurance account, which means they'll then genuinely get their state pension when they get old enough. It seems to me that the entitlement bit has never been properly reviewed for years, probably decades.
Sorry, people on shows that already credit
Credits.
that already happens.
So yeah, so you're saying that if you've got carers allowance, you get credits towards your national insurance record. Yeah.
Claim ESA, you get national insurance credits if you're not entitled to any money.
Yeah.
But you have to claim.
Yeah.
That's the point.
Okay. Yeah. So people still falling through basically they're not paying that and finding them not entitled to state pension. Okay. And then the third person.
Yeah, thank you. Regent Banerjee from Hounslow, Middlesex. It's just a point I'd like to pick up here, carrying on from the other questions or other point makers, and based on what I've just heard here. The logical step for me, and I'm not an expert in anything at all, but the logical step to me sounds as though we might be looking at a universal income for old age pensioners.
Yeah, thank you for those questions. We'll do a second tranche, but yeah, it'd be really useful in terms of, Wendy, would you like to take any of those?
Yeah, and I mean, getting people into work clearly should be at the heart of what any government is looking to achieve, and obviously that's what the new government want to do in terms of economic growth. But I think there's no doubt that in the last few years, the previous government were pretty punitive about their approach to that. Work capability assessments, etc., have not felt like it's a way of enabling people into work. It's about penalising those who haven't been able to. On the national insurance one, I do think there is an argument around what does that state pension entitlement look like. My mum still talks about paying in her stamp, and we really should have and think about how we can move on from that. And I think one of the sort of issues when governments do little tweaks or different things is sometimes there's a lack of thought of unintended consequences. So one of the things that I was raising in the last Parliament was the fact that obviously the Cameron government did away with or capped when you could claim child benefit in terms of, and of course in the last Conservative budget they increased the level for that because there had been complaints about the 40,000-60,000 that it was too, that it was that basically it had not taken into place inflationaries. But one of the things I didn't know, and I'm grateful to Sir Steve Webb for this, was that if you don't apply for that child benefit, and if you're in a family where you know you're not going to qualify, why would you apply for something that you know that you're not entitled to apply for? But it means that the parent who isn't working, which is predominantly women, don't then get their national insurance credits in relation to that. Who knows that? So, and that just creates unintended consequences and difficulties in the system. And I'm really sorry I had an emergency message there and I missed the third question, so I might need to repeat it. Apologies.
It's around universal basic income as a solution to the problem.
Yeah. Now, obviously, the party have been around universal basic income in debates. I think it was one of the first things that I spoke about in our virtual conference in September 2020. I think our policy development is moving on a little from there, because I think one of the key challenges I was on the working group was that what we wanted to do and the cost of that was quite difficult. And my own view was that going back to liberal principles, the delivery of state pension, back to Lloyd George and Asquith. I'm always going to be an Asquith person, given that I'm MP for North East Fife, so apologies to any Lloyd George achievements out there, is that we need to probably start small in relation to that. But I think it all ties into what is that assessment of need, what do people actually require, because at the moment I do agree that our benefit system is completely arbitrary and we get into percentages and increases without actually thinking about what people need.
Great, thanks. John?
Well, just to come in on that last one, if I might, and I'm not at all an expert on this, so there'll be many experts in the room, I'm sure, but I was in Scotland a few weeks ago talking about this, it came up in the discussion. I think it's the Poverty Alliance in Scotland who've done some work, not so much on a universal basic income, but on the minimum income guarantee.
Yes,
so that's a different way of looking at it, because as I understand it, the universal what's it called? Universal basic income, thank you, is where you give the same amount to everybody. Whereas the minimum income guarantee is where you look at everything they've got and say, a bit like we were talking about adequacy, everybody needs to reach this amount. So it might be made up of all kinds of different things, different forms of income, but where there's a gap, then you look to fill that. And as I understand, some of that work that's been done in Scotland is that you look to do that over a number of years. So you probably can't get to it immediately, but that's what it's a progressive way of looking at it. So I thought I'd just share that because, it seems like a good way of looking at things.
My frustration, sorry, just to come in before Alfie comes in, is probably the Scottish Government. We're talking about pilots, but those haven't necessarily materialised, and I think we're facing some of the same challenges in Scotland as we had before the general election here. A government who's in power for a long time, but potentially we would expect me to say that. But
Yeah, just a couple of thoughts to answer those questions. So one, on this point about work, which I think is fundamental, but the piece that often gets missed from this, it's not just about people getting into work or being in work, it's also the quality of work and how long they stay there. And you know, to some extent that's a slightly missed point, because over the last 10 years we've had a work-first approach to labour market policy. So to some extent it's not that missed. People do talk about job quality, but I think the piece that's really not there is the relationship between welfare adequacy and the quality of work, and how there's actually a positive synergy there that is not tapped into. Because if you have more adequate welfare support, you do two things. You improve the negotiating position of those who are not in work in terms of the work they are seeking and demanding, and which employers have to match in order to fill their vacancies. And what that then does is it improves the skills matching. People end up in jobs that are better suited to them, and they stay there longer, and that's been shown to have broader macroeconomic benefits as well. So there's a whole piece there in that debate where both there's a blind spot and a missing synergy that isn't talked about enough. On the universal income point, I just want to add one thing, which was it links back to the conversation about pension credit actually, and how do you boost entitlement, which is wherever you stand on universal payments in terms of a response to the broader question of hardship and economic security, it is an absolute no-brainer that if you have universal payments in place, they are a huge opportunity to build some of the data sets that we're currently lacking to then be able to provide more targeted support in a more effective way. And this is one of the real shames about the winter fuel payment debate, because we essentially had there a universal basic income for people over a certain age. It was very small, that was pegged to winter fuel payments, but it was really a universal basic income of £200 a year. But at no point was that system used to get the information necessary to then pay people targeted pension credit support. And the government could have said, or any government that wants to move to needs testing, irrespective of whether it's a good move or not, let's say that you're doing it, you could say, well, we'll do it in 2 years' time, but to keep the winter fuel payment for those 2 years, give us your information around your income and your situation. And you would then see the eligibility and people's awareness of pension credit, and in fact the means to pay people automatically would have been there in 2 years' time. So big missed opportunity there, I think, as well.
Thank you. Person back there, yeah, you. Stay with the glasses, yeah. And then this guy also with glasses.
Sorry, was that me?
So yeah, it was you. Those three, yeah.
Hello, I'm Sue Christopher from Parkinson's UK, and I want to raise a point about pension credit. As part of my job, I go around the country and speak to people living with Parkinson's about how to maximise their income. And the biggest issue, and this has been backed up by some research conducted by Policy and Practice, the biggest issue I've encountered is that people do not want to touch benefits with a barge pole because they're so highly stigmatised. In fact, on one occasion when I was presenting to a group of people, one person wouldn't even sit at the table at which I was presenting. That's how strongly she didn't want to be associated with being a benefit claimant. So we have an example, a model, if you like, of effective destigmatisation to a degree at least, in the form of the Mental Health Time to Change campaign, which was run by Mind and others under the auspices, if that's indeed the right word, of Paul Farmer, who's now at UK, of course. So I wonder if there's an opportunity to seek funding, again, from DWP or DHSE, to do an equivalent to destigmatise. It's a massive job, admittedly, to destigmatise the claimant of benefits.
Hi, Flora Stark. I'm Vice Chair of Edinburgh West. Christine Jarden is our MP. I just wanted to ask a question about data and where you get it. You've obviously been able to supply a lot of interesting figures, particularly 500,000 people living in private rented accommodation. That's quite an interesting figure. And how do you get that? Also, the map, very interesting map on here. Again, how you get the information about people living in poverty. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Jake Marchington. I've come down from West Yorkshire as a member. I guess I'm here as a young person. I know we've talked a lot about pension state, and we've how we've had the triple lock for 10 years, and that's done a really good job in bringing down pensioner poverty a lot, which is great, but that also at the same time, child poverty and working age poverty has increased. And I guess the other theme I want to link that to is how in the UK we have an ageing population, which I'm sure you're well aware of, and that actually we're not in a great position today. We've got a lot to do, but that actually, from a perspective of how many working people we have and how many pensioners we have, we're in the best place we will be for the next century to act on these issues and actually deal with poverty and get people out of poverty. So I guess, and you know, we talk a lot in politics about short-termism. So when we're looking ahead 20 years, when we're going to have twice as many pensioners and half as many working age people, how is our society going to function? And I guess, how do we ensure intergenerational equality, that child poverty and working age poverty are getting focused when we'll have a lot more elderly voters, and how do we maintain that sort of demographic legitimacy? You know, we have a social contract where, as a child, the state supports you, gets you trained up, and then you work, you put your years in, you contribute, and then when you're old, you can retire and then you live a decent life. But at the moment, we need to make sure that we're setting up institutions and making investments today that mean that older age people can be supported in the future in a way that's sustainable when we know we're going to have less working age people to support them. And I guess that's my question. Are we thinking of these 10 years, the 20 years, the 50-year timescales when the situation is going to be a lot worse, even though it isn't great today either?
Thanks. Great questions, thanks everyone. So we've got destigmatising benefits, data and local effects, and then this sort of inverted pyramid problem.
Will I go first just because I need to probably
of
5 minutes, and apologies for that, I've got a media thing to do. So I think stigma around benefits is really important, and certainly that seems to be part of the answer to the reason why pension credit is a lower uptake. And right in my opening remarks, I obviously talked about COVID and the fact that there was people who came into contact with the benefit system for the first time who hadn't, and it was a real eye-opener. I'd love to say that a campaign from government would help with that. I'm just not convinced, and the reason why I say I'm not convinced is just because a lot of the stigma around benefit claims and claimants and views of benefit claimants don't necessarily come from within government or civil society. They come from within media outlets that are quite happy to talk about benefit scroungers and asylum seekers crossing in small boats on the one hand, but then running campaigns against the winter fuel allowance on the other. And so I think we clearly need to do a lot more. I'm just not sure whether a government campaign on that is the right answer. In terms of data, I think, Flora, I think what's really important is the census and the integrity of the census. And obviously you and I will share the concern of the fact that we've still not got data from the Scottish census. And I think that is going to present some real issues for the Scottish Government and indeed the UK Government in terms of its dealing with the continued devolving of benefits, the fact that we don't have a clear data set in Scotland yet in relation to the census. But I think it's really important that we ensure that when we're doing those data sets, we get as high an uptake as possible and we keep people engaged with the integrity of that. And that's where misinformation can be a real issue. And then finally, on young people, I'll just say a couple of things in relation to that. I've always argued that the triple lock is not just important for pensioners of today, but for the pensioners of the future. That when you have young people who potentially got more fractured work life, I joined the police service at 22 with an expectation I'd be retiring in, I'll not tell you how many years' time, but my intention at that time was that I was going to join the police service and I was going to stay in it. And increasingly that's not what people do. And I think our overall pension system hasn't necessarily caught up with that reality. But I've always argued that with young people in less secure work potentially, 0-hour contracts, getting on the housing ladder, etc., one of the things about the triple lock is it should guarantee an increase in state pension that allows it to keep up with, to some extent, the cost of living. Though obviously we're talking about the fact that adequacy of benefits is one of the things in relation to it. But I think it's a bit like social care in terms of that strategic stuff. And this, I never thought we'd talk about electoral reform in a meeting like this, but I think there is absolutely no doubt that our political system in the UK does not drive long-term thinking from politicians. And that's one of the reasons why we've talked about the need for cross-party work in relation to solving social care, because the reality is whatever government of whatever colour is in power, you know, the cannot continue for much longer. So it is about potentially, you know, politicians such as myself being a bit more grown up in our approach, building up those cross-party alliances, and I think that's got to be the starting point. But I'm not going to pretend that is an easy thing that can be achieved necessarily, but it's clearly something that has to be.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So in answer to Sue's question about stigma, you are absolutely right. It's the number one issue, Sue, isn't it? Because it's a very difficult thing for people who have, many of them, worked all their lives in a variety of different ways, to kind of supplicate themselves in front of the state. That's a difficult thing to do. And I think there's a number of things we can do about it, and one of them is to change the way we talk about things. Claimant is not a pleasant word. It sort of implies that it's something that you're not really entitled to, you know, that you have to go and, as the Tory minister said to me, kind of supplicate in front of the state. So I think there's a lot we could do around changing the language and changing the way we talk about what people are entitled to. So that would be my first point. Second one to Flora, yeah, the data, as was said, comes from the census mainly. We also talk to lots of older people, and so we're able to get some stories that can kind of put a human face to those numbers. And I know Morgan, who's sitting in the front or down at the back, would be very happy to talk to you about how we put that together, if that's of interest. And then on Jake's point, that was a big proper question, which I probably can't do justice to. What I would say is, I think we've got to be really careful with these issues, and that's why it's wonderful to have a range of people on the platform, that we're not just talking, and we're certainly not setting up in opposition to each other, the issues of different groups in society. Child poverty, of course, is as important as older people's poverty, and so it's great that we've, for instance, been able to work with Generation Rent on the issues that face anyone who's renting. It's great that we're talking to Trussell, who are telling us about the older people, the increase in older people, sadly, going to food banks. And we've got to work together on this stuff, just as Wendy rightly said, cross-party. So when I was with Emma Reynolds, the pensions minister last week, she was saying, in the pensions area, obviously, these are long-term policies that you have to get right. So, for instance, it was the Labour government who commissioned the review that caused the next government, the Conservative government, to do what do we call it? The thing where you have to set aside auto-enrolment, that's it, the auto-enrolments you have to say. And those things, she was saying, as pensions minister, she is not going to take long-term decisions on pensions issues without talking to other parties, because she'd be mad to do so. So it's all of our jobs to make sure we hold everybody to that.
We're sorry to go, Wendy, but thank you very much for
Thank you.
I think you want to talk back on.
Yeah, just a few quick thoughts. So the point about stigma, I think, is critical, and it's the really hard one to crack. But I think it is why it's so important to think about how do you use lines of support that are not highly stigmatised, like the winter fuel payment, in order to collect the information to auto-enroll people onto benefits that are at risk of stigmatism. And this is why I want these as a route to solving this. That's such an important area. On the question about data, just add a couple of things. So yes, census data, but obviously between census years that can be far apart, we have a problem with data gaps. And what we tend to use in those years is a mixture of admin data from government, what they publish either freely or what they're forced to publish through questions in the House or elsewhere. But also really important large N national surveys. So a lot of the numbers that I use, that others use, come from these large national surveys. So they're estimates based on the proportionate sample and they're sort of gross stuff. And there are big ones on the labour market, on household incomes. There are some that track people across a lifetime. So these surveys are really critical to getting a picture, but they're not flawless. And the point about dependency ratio and working age, I think this is obviously really key. It does mean you have to put on the agenda, going back to these issues, some of the ones I mentioned earlier, around housing, security of housing, around quality of work, things that are critical, particularly for working age young households. But I also think there's a broader point around the way in which we discuss this issue of dependency ratio, the pressure from demographic change, in that when our big institutions do forecasts in this space, so for example, the Office of Budget Responsibility, what they tend to do is say, oh right, the working population is diminishing as a proportion of the population, and they say, well, what effect does that have on debt? And they tend to then project this really scary graph of how our debt's going to rise because we've got fewer people working and more people in old age. But actually, if you flipped that and said, well, hang on a minute, let's say that we held debt constant, and instead we looked at what happens as we've got fewer taxpayers and an ageing population, what happens to the quality of services that people get, and you see the chart dropping off a cliff in the opposite direction. And actually the real risk is that we see the NHS collapse, we see care collapse, we see provision for homelessness collapse, because the resources aren't there to meet it. So I think there's a shift in the way we do the debate as well. Thank you.
So, Fred, we've run out of time for questions, so just final remarks, really. So, Joanna, final remarks?
Yeah, thanks. Well, it's great to have a packed room, isn't it, for such an important debate, and thank you very much for the people who came and even sat on the floor. I really appreciate that. Sorry we couldn't give you a chair. Yeah, I mean, our mission at Independent Age is about making sure that all of us can live in older age with dignity, choice and purpose. And I think everybody in this room would agree that that's where we need to get to. I think we can only do that together. So we published a statement of intent earlier this year, which 70 relevant organisations, many of them in this room, have signed. And we'd love to sign your statements too, because only by working together, highlighting those issues, it's hard, this stuff. You can't give up, you've just got to keep at it. That's the only way we will see change. So thank you very much for all you do to make sure that these issues remain so firmly on the agenda, and we look forward to working with you.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, not a huge amount to add, Joanna. So thank you very much for coming. Thanks for the questions. Really useful conversation.
Great, yeah, it's been super rich conversation. Thanks to the panelists and thanks for everyone for coming. Cheers. Thank you.